Hello, ladies and gentlemen. There comes a moment in the aftermath of a painful relationship when the noise settles, the arguments fade, the confusion begins to clear, and you're left sitting in silence with one lingering question. What just happened to me? It's in that moment of quiet that something unexpected creeps in, not just the memory of what they said or did, but a deeper ache, like an echo coming from inside you. You begin to realize that what hurt the most wasn't what happened on the outside. What really broke you was what had awakened within you. Because here's the truth, what they reflected back at you wasn't about them. It was about you. We often talk about people as if they have the power to define us. They made me feel invisible. They made me doubt my worth. They made me feel like I was never enough. And while that language helps us give voice to our pain, there comes a time when healing requires a harder look, one that asks, why did I believe them? Why did their version of me feel more true than my own? We rarely walk into these relationships as blank slates. We bring stories, deep ones, old ones. And sometimes they're buried so far down that we don't even know we're carrying them. Stories like, I have to earn love. I need to be perfect to be accepted. My needs are too much. If I speak up, I'll be abandoned. Then someone comes along and confirms those stories, not always with words, but with behavior, by withholding affection, invalidating our feelings, shifting blame, or retreating into silence. And because the story feels so familiar, we don't question it. Instead, we accept the reflection as truth. The mirror they held up didn't show you who they were. It showed you what you were already afraid was true about yourself. That's the shock. It's not their treatment of you that lingers, it's the realization of how quickly and deeply you internalized it. But that's not the whole picture. There's another part of you that shows up in that reflection, one that is just as real and far more powerful. The part of you that tried, that kept loving, that kept hoping, that bent and stretched and reached for connection because something in you believed it could be better. That part is not weakness. That's not codependence. That's your capacity for love. That's your courage. And maybe you're angry with that part of you. Maybe you feel shame for staying, for accommodating, for not walking away sooner. That's okay. Shame thrives on silence, and healing begins when we speak it aloud. So let's name it. You stayed because you wanted it to mean something. You stayed because love is hardwired into your being. You stayed because something in you believed that if you just loved them enough, they might finally see you. But here's the radical, uncomfortable truth. You were never meant to be seen through them. That was never their job. And the moment you realize that is the moment the mirror shatters, not in destruction, but in liberation. You start to understand that your reflection was distorted, that what you saw wasn't weakness, it was woundedness. And wounds can heal. Not through fixing someone else, but through coming home to yourself. You begin to rewrite the story. From I wasn't enough to I was more than they could handle. From I was too much to I was brave enough to feel deeply. From they didn't choose me to I get to choose me now. That's the real shock. Not that they mirrored your pain, but that you now have the power to choose what's true. That you are no longer defined by their reflection. That you are allowed, more than allowed, worthy to define yourself. And maybe that's the most beautiful, terrifying part of all. Once the mirror breaks, you're left with just you. No projections, no roles to perform. Just you raw, real, imperfect, and whole. That's where the work begins. And that's where freedom lives. There's a quiet kind of pain that doesn't scream, it whispers. It sits beneath the surface of our everyday life, quietly shaping the way we love, the way we trust, and the way we allow ourselves to be seen. And the most dangerous part, most of us don't even realize it's there until we're looking back in the rearview mirror of a relationship that broke us in ways we didn't see coming. When we enter a relationship, we carry more than just our hopes and dreams. We carry every unhealed wound we've ever survived. Wounds from childhood, from abandonment, from betrayal, from being told, whether outright or in subtle, lingering ways, that our emotions were too big, our needs too much, our presence too inconvenient. And when we don't acknowledge those wounds, when we haven't held them up to the light, we end up walking into love with a heart full of questions we're not even aware we're asking. Am I enough? Can I be loved just as I am? Will I be left again if I show defiance? Now imagine stepping into a relationship where the other person doesn't say these answers out loud, but they reflect them. They mirror your deepest fears without even trying. When you reach for affection and they pull away, that old wound whispers, see? You ask for too much. When you express your feelings and they dismiss them, it reinforces your emotions don't matter. You should keep quiet. When they gaslight or blame shift, it doesn't just confuse you, it hits an old bruise, one that says maybe it's always been your fault. This isn't about blame, it's about truth. It's about understanding that the mirror they held up didn't start with them, it started with your past. With those moments when your worthiness felt uncertain, when love had strings attached, when you learned that safety meant shrinking. And because those wounds have been whispering for so long, we mistake the echo for reality. We mistake familiarity for love. There's something heartbreaking about realizing that part of why you stayed was because it felt familiar. It felt like home. but not the kind of home that nurtures or heals, the kind that keeps you locked in an old pattern, an old identity. And when you live inside that kind of reflection for long enough, you don't just lose the relationship. You lose your sense of self. You find yourself walking on eggshells, not because someone told you to, but because your body remembers what it's like to be punished for stepping too loudly. You find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, because somewhere along the line you learned that peace only exists when you carry the blame. You shape-shift, you silence yourself, you give and give because a part of you still believes that if you're good enough, calm enough, loving enough, they'll stop withholding, they'll stop hurting you, they'll finally choose you. But the truth is, they were never the one you were trying to convince. You were trying to convince yourself. The hardest part of healing is facing the fact that we didn't just get hurt, we were reopened. The mirror they held up didn't create new wounds. It brought the old ones back into view. And when that happens, it's not just pain you're feeling, it's grief. Grief for the parts of you that never got what they needed. Grief for how long you believed that love meant proving your worth instead of resting in it. But here's the thing about wounds: once you see them, you can choose to stop hiding them. You can choose to stop letting them make your choices for you. You can name them, tend to them, love them back to life. It takes courage to admit that what hurt the most wasn't just the other person, it was the way they echoed something you were already afraid was true. But it's in that courage that healing lies, because when you can name the wound, you can learn to speak over it. When you can recognize the old pattern, you can start to disrupt it. And one day, that same mirror, the one that once reflected your fears, starts reflecting your strength. Not because they changed, but because you did. Because you listened to the whisper, not to stay stuck, but to finally understand. To finally come home not to the familiar pain, but to the version of yourself who knows she is worthy, even when the reflection tells her otherwise. That's the beginning of freedom. Not when the mirror changes, but when you stop needing it to define you. We don't always recognize shame when it shows up. It doesn't walk through the door announcing itself, wearing a name tag that says, "Hi, I'm shame." No, it's quieter than that. It's subtle. It wears disguises. And one of its most convincing disguises is loyalty. You tell yourself you're staying because you're loyal. Because love doesn't walk away. Because you're not a quitter. Because you see the best in people and you're willing to weather the storms with them. You tell yourself that real love means standing by someone even when it's hard. Even when it hurts. Even when every part of you is slowly unraveling. But here's the truth we don't talk about enough. Sometimes what we call loyalty is actually shame in disguise. It's the fear of what it would mean to walk away. It's the voice that says, if you leave, you're abandoning them. If you let go, you're giving up. If you speak up, you're causing problems. Shame twists the narrative so that staying silent becomes honorable. Shrinking yourself becomes noble. Enduring mistreatment becomes proof of your devotion. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly over time. It starts with justifying the little things, the dismissive comment, the subtle disrespect, the way your boundaries are brushed aside, then bulldozed, and somehow you end up being the one apologizing for setting them in the first place. You find yourself explaining away the patterns that hurt you. They're just stressed. It's not that bad. Everyone has flaws. You keep making excuses, not because you're naive, but because you're afraid of what it means if you name the truth out loud. Afraid that if you acknowledge the harm, then you'll have to do something about it. And what if that something means walking away? What if it means starting over? What if it means admitting that the person you love never actually saw you at all? Shame doesn't want you to go there. It convinces you that it's more admirable to stay, even if staying costs you your peace, your voice, your joy. It whispers that your pain isn't valid because you're too sensitive, too emotional, too needy. And over time, you begin to internalize those labels. You begin to think that loyalty means adapting to the pain, learning to live with it, even when it's eating away at you. You forget that love is supposed to feel safe. So you stay. And you call it love, you call it loyalty. But underneath, it's shame steering the ship. Because shame tells you that your worth is tied to how much you can endure. That if you were just better, more understanding, more forgiving, more patient, maybe they'd treat you differently. Shame says try harder, not because it leads to healing, but because it keeps you stuck. There's nothing shame fears more than boundaries. Because boundaries say I matter. My feelings are valid. My needs are real. And when you've been living under the weight of shame for long enough, where words feel dangerous, they feel selfish. But they are anything but. They are life-saving. The heartbreak of this realization doesn't just come from recognizing how long you've been hurting. It comes from understanding how long you've been trying to prove your worth through pain, how long you've mistaken survival for love, how long you've allowed shame to masquerade as devotion. But here's where your power begins, not in blaming yourself, not in criticizing your younger, hurting self, but in offering her compassion. She stayed because she believed that was love. She stayed because she thought that was the only way to be chosen. She stayed because no one ever told her that loyalty to yourself matters too. You get to tell her now. You get to say loyalty is beautiful, but it should never require your silence. Love is powerful, but it should never come at the cost of your identity. Endurance is noble, but not when it's used to justify your own erasure. You are not disloyal for choosing peace. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not weak for saying enough. There is nothing shameful about walking away from what harms you. The only shame is staying in something that convinces you that pain is the price of love. And even then, that shame doesn't belong to you. It never did. It's time to take it off. It's time to stop calling it loyalty when what it really is fear wrapped in silence. And you don't have to live like that anymore. We all want to belong. It's one of the deepest human needs to feel seen, heard, accepted, loved. Not for who we might become, not for the role we play, but for who we are when we let our guard down and exhale. The longing for that kind of connection can be so strong that we'll do almost anything to get it, even if it means slowly disconnecting from ourselves. Sometimes, without even realizing it, we seek belonging in places that demand our silence. We give parts of ourselves away just to keep the peace. We tiptoe around their moods. We shrink our needs, our voice, our truth, just to avoid conflict. We start to confuse being tolerated with being loved. And when the small moments of tenderness appear, we cling to them like proof that the connection is real, proof that the struggle is worth it, proof that maybe, just maybe, we finally belong. But deep down, something always feels off. You can't name it at first, it's not loud. It's subtle. It shows up as that tightness in your chest when you're around them, that hesitation before you speak, that second guessing before you share how you really feel. You start editing yourself, not because they asked you to, but because you learned that being your full self makes the ground beneath you shake. So you disconnect. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, bit by bit. You stop sharing your dreams because they rolled their eyes the last time. You downplay your success because it makes them uncomfortable. You stop bringing up what bothers you because it always turns into a fight. And slowly, you go from being an equal in the relationship to being a version of yourself that's easier to digest, more agreeable, less complex, less emotional, less you. But here's the thing about disconnection: the more you do it, the lonelier you feel. And the lonelier you feel, the harder you work to keep the connection alive, ironically, by disconnecting even more. You become a master at pretending everything's fine. You smile when you want to cry. You give when you're running on empty. You tell yourself that this is what relationships are supposed to be, that love is supposed to be hard. That compromise means losing pieces of yourself if it keeps the other person close. And maybe it worked for a while. Maybe those brief moments of connection kept you holding on. Maybe the good times made the disconnection feel worth it. But at some point, you wake up and realize that the person you're fighting to stay connected to hasn't actually seen the real you in a long time. And maybe, just maybe, you haven't either, because when you trade authenticity for attachment, you don't just lose the relationship, you lose yourself. You lose your voice, your spark, your center. You start to forget what it feels like to be fully alive, to be fully known, to be fully you. And the most painful part, you realize that the belonging you were chasing never actually existed. It was conditional. It was based on performance, on how small you could make yourself, on how well you could play a role that didn't ask questions, didn't need too much, didn't push too hard. That's not belonging. That's survival. Real belonging never requires disconnection. Real love doesn't flinch when you speak your truth. It doesn't punish your vulnerability. It doesn't shrink in the presence of your wholeness. Real love expands when you do. It welcomes your complexity. It makes room for your needs. It sits with your discomfort, not because it's easy, but because you're worth it. So if you're in a space where you constantly feel like you're too much or not enough, where your silence is the price of admission, where your intuition is always being questioned, I want you to hear this clearly. That's not where you belong. Belonging doesn't ask you to be less. It invites you to be more. It calls you back to yourself. It says you're allowed to take up space here. You're allowed to feel what you feel. You're allowed to exist without apology. And if you've been disconnecting for a long time, it's okay to grieve that. It's okay to feel the weight of all the pieces of yourself you tucked away just to be loved. But you get to come home now. You get to reclaim every part of you that was put on pause. You get to unlearn the belief that love requires losing yourself. Because the truth is, you were never too much. You were just in a place that couldn't hold you. And now, you're free to choose a place that can. There's a moment after the storm of a painful relationship passes, when you start to sift through the wreckage, not just of what happened, but of who you became inside it. You replay the conversations, the gaslighting, the confusion, the guilt. You remember the times you cried quietly in the dark, wondering what you were doing wrong. You think back to how much you gave, how much you stretched, how much you stayed. And somewhere in all of that, a lie begins to form. A quiet but powerful whisper. There must be something wrong with me. It's easy to believe that. especially when you've been in a space where your pain was minimized, your needs were dismissed, and your love was used more than it was received. You look into that emotional mirror expecting to see yourself, but what you see instead feels like damage. You see how exhausted you are, how sensitive, how insecure, how small you've become. And the reflection says, see, you're the problem. But that mirror didn't reflect your brokenness. It reflected your capacity to care, your capacity to hope, your capacity to believe in someone even when they gave you every reason not to. That relationship didn't expose how damaged you were. It revealed how deeply you feel, how hard you love, and how willing you are to fight for connection. That's not weakness. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's humanity in its rawest form. You didn't stay because you were desperate. You stayed because you saw something you believed was worth saving, something you hoped to heal. And yes, maybe you stayed too long. Maybe you overextended. But those choices didn't come from brokenness. They came from hope. They came from a heart that hadn't given up yet, that still believed in growth, in redemption, in the possibility that things could be better. And that's the hard part, isn't it? Because in the aftermath, it's easy to look at all that love and energy you poured in and call it a mistake. It's easy to feel foolish. But what if it wasn't foolishness? What if it was proof? Proof that even when you were being torn down, you didn't forget how to build. That even when you were being disregarded, you remembered how to see people. That even when your needs were neglected, you knew how to show up. The pain you feel now, that ache, the confusion, that grief, it's not evidence that you're broken. It's evidence that you were brave, that you were fully in, that you risked something real, that you gave from a place of wholeness, not because you were incomplete, but because you had so much to give. And if the person on the other side couldn't meet you there, if they couldn't hold the space you created, if they took and couldn't return it, that's not a reflection of your inadequacy. It's a reflection of their limits. It's one of the hardest lessons to learn that someone else's inability to receive your love is not a verdict on its worth, that your emotional depth is not a flaw, that your longing for closeness, your craving for truth and safety is not something to be shut down. It's something to be honored. You are not too much. You're not weak for wanting to be chosen. You're not broken for feeling deeply. You're not naive for having faith in people. You just loved in a place that wasn't ready. You offered something sacred in a space that couldn't receive it. But the offering, that came from power. So maybe instead of asking, why did I stay? Ask, what did this reveal about me? Did it reveal your resilience, your loyalty, your depth, your endurance? Did it show you how much you're willing to invest in someone's potential? Did it teach you how to listen, how to forgive, how to try again? None of that is brokenness, that's capacity. And yes, you're allowed to have boundaries now. You're allowed to protect your peace. You're allowed to say, I will no longer pour myself out for someone who won't even meet me halfway. That's not hard-heartedness. That's wisdom earned through pain. So when you look in the mirror today, really look, don't search for what was lost. Look for what endured. Look for the strength it took to keep showing up. Look for the fire that's still there beneath the ashes. Look for the version of you who didn't let that pain define them. Because that mirror, though it was distorted by their limitations, still told the truth in one powerful way. Your love is real. Your capacity is vast. And you are not broken, you're becoming. Healing is not always loud. It doesn't always look like epiphanies or breakthroughs. Sometimes it's quiet, so quiet you don't even realize it's happening. It starts in the small, sacred moments when you begin to see yourself clearly after a long time of only seeing yourself through someone else's distortion. It's when the fog begins to lift, and for the first time in what feels like forever, you catch a glimpse not of the version of you who is performing, pleasing, or surviving, but of the you who's always been there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be believed. When you've spent so long in a relationship that required you to disconnect from yourself, the mirror can become a painful place. Because it doesn't just reflect your features, it reflects all the things you compromised, all the truths you swallowed, all the ways you silenced your own voice just to keep the peace, just to feel a little bit loved, even if it came with strings attached. You don't just see yourself, you see the version of you that was trying so hard to be chosen. And that's what makes healing so tender. It's not just about getting over someone else. It's about returning to the relationship you have with yourself, the one that got fractured when you started believing you were only lovable when you were quiet, agreeable, or easy. Healing is about looking in the mirror and no longer seeing someone who wasn't enough, but seeing someone who was too strong, too kind, too full of life to keep living under someone else's shadow. It's seeing your softness and no longer calling it weakness, seeing your needs and no longer labeling them as burdens, seeing your scars and realizing they're not proof of failure, but proof that you survived something that tried to erase you. And you did survive. You survived the gaslighting. You survived the emotional manipulation. You survived the cycles of hope and hurt. You survived being made to feel small just for having a heart that wanted more. And the mirror now, this mirror you're learning to trust again, is not here to shame you. It's here to show you everything that stayed intact, everything that stayed true. Healing is when you can look at your own reflection and not flinch. When you can look into your own eyes and say, I see you, I believe you, I trust you. It's when you begin to realize that you were never too much, you were simply in a space that couldn't hold you. You were never asking for too much, you were just asking the wrong person. And you were never broken, you were bending, adapting, surviving. There's something holy about the moment you stop searching for yourself and someone else's validation. When you stop waiting for a relationship to give you permission to feel worthy. When you no longer measure your value by how much someone else wants you, needs you, or stays. Healing is when that measuring stick breaks, when you decide that the only one who needs to choose you is you. It's not always pretty. Some days you'll feel like you're making progress, and other days you'll be back in the grief, in the doubt, in the ache. That's okay. Healing isn't linear. It's cyclical. It comes in waves. But every time you choose to stay with yourself in the discomfort, every time you choose compassion over criticism, every time you say, I will not abandon myself again, that's healing. It's walking past the mirror and pausing, not to fix your appearance, not to critique yourself, but to say, there she is. She's been here all along, and I'm not leaving her again. It's showing up for yourself in the small ways, getting rest, saying no, honoring your boundaries, letting yourself feel without judgment. It's allowing your own reflection to feel like home again. Not because you've become someone new, but because you've returned to the person you were before the world or a relationship told you to be someone else. Yourself.